The steam rising from the bowl of soup was the only warning I had before the world turned into a blur of scalding heat and stinging pain. I could hear the sharp intake of breath from the people sitting around the table, but the sound that cut through the silence like a knife was the mocking laughter of my son's mother-in-law, Clara. She stood there with the empty porcelain bowl in her hand, looking down at me, as if I were a stray dog that had dared to sit at her table she had spent the last year, making my life a living hell ever since my son David married her daughter Julia, believing that her family's old name and dusty portraits gave her the right to treat everyone else like dirt. She didn't know that the very roof over her head was held up by my signatures, or that the ground she walked on was part of an estate I had purchased long before David even met her daughter. I sat there for a moment, feeling the soup drip down my cheeks and onto my silk dress, while David froze in shock, unable to move or speak against the woman he now feared more than he respected me. Julia looked away, her face a mask of cold indifference, as if my agony was merely a social inconvenience. But as the heat began to fade into a dull throb, I felt a different kind of fire ignite deep within my chest, a cold and calculating fury that had built empires and crushed rivals. In the boardroom, Clara leaned in closer voice, a venomous whisper telling me that I should learn my place, and that no matter how much money I thought I had, I would always be a commoner in her eyes. She told me to leave her house and never return, not knowing that it was the last mistake she would ever make. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I simply stood up and wiped my face with a linen napkin that cost more than her monthly pension. And I looked her straight in the eye with a calm that made her smirk falter. For just a second, I reached into my handbag and pulled out my phone, not to call an ambulance, but to dial a number that sat at the top of my speed dial for emergencies. Exactly like this one, the voice on the other end was deep and professional, the voice of the man who had handled every acquisition and eviction for my firm for the last 20 years. I told him the address and gave him a single instruction to execute the immediate repossession clause on the property and to serve the eviction papers within an hour. I hung up without waiting for a reply and walked out of the dining room without looking back at my son or the woman who thought she had won. I sat in my car in the driveway, watching the lights of the mansion flicker like a dying star, and I remembered every insult, every snide remark, and every time they had made me feel small because of my humble beginnings. I thought about how Clara had bragged about her family heritage while living on the allowance I secretly funneled through David's accounts, and how Julia had spent my hard-earned money on designer bags while treating me like the help. Exactly 45 minutes later, a black sedan pulled into the driveway, and 3 men in dark suits stepped out, carrying away the law in their leather briefcases. They didn't knock. They simply entered using the master key I had provided, and the screams that erupted from the house were far more satisfying than any shout I could have let out. Clara was dragged to the front door in her silk robe, her face pale and trembling, as she was told that her lease was terminated and that the property had been reclaimed by the primary creditor for breach of conduct and non-payment. I rolled down my window as she stood on the lawn, surrounded by her suitcases and the wreckage of her pride, and I told her that since she wanted to treat me like a beggar, she could now experience what it felt like to have nowhere to go. David tried to run to my car, begging for mercy, but I simply looked at him and realized that a son who watches his mother be assaulted is no son of mine. I drove away into the night, leaving them in the cold darkness of the street, and as the sun began to rise over the city, I knew that by morning there would be nothing more than a memory in the halls of the house I once built. The hot soup had burned my skin, but it had finally cleared my vision, and for the first time in years, I was truly free of the vultures I had been feeding with my own heart. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity as I sat in my penthouse office overlooking the city skyline, watching the rain begin to fall against the glass, and thinking about the decades I had spent building the wall of protection around my family that they had so carelessly tried to tear down. Clara didn't realize that I knew every skeleton in her closet and every cent of debt her family had hidden behind those old oil paintings and heavy curtains. While she was throwing soup at my face, I was thinking about the bank records I had acquired 3 months ago, showing that her grandfather had gambled away the family fortune in the 80s, and that they had been living on borrowed time and my secret charity ever since David had been blinded by Julia's beauty and the allure of an old name. But he had forgotten the smell of the grease and the sound of the machines in the factory where I had spent my youth earning every dollar that now sat in his trust fund. I pulled up the files on my computer screen and saw the list of properties Clara still thought She owned only to realize that my holding company had bought the notes on all of them during the last housing crisis, meaning I didn't just own their home, I owned her car, the office building her brother worked in, and even the small cottage where she spent her summers. She was about to find out that when you strike the queen, you had better make sure she doesn't get back up, because I was about to systematically dismantle every comfort she had left in this world. I called my head of security and told him to change the locks on the summer house and to repossess the luxury SUV that was registered under my corporate fleet. And by the time the clock struck midnight, the women, who had treated me like a peasant, were standing on a sidewalk with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a few bags of designer shoes that wouldn't keep them warm in the damp night air. David called me 32 times in 1 hour, his voice getting more desperate with every message, but I didn't listen to a single word because I was busy drafting a new will that removed him as the beneficiary of my estate and redirected every single penny to a foundation for women who have suffered domestic abuse at the hands of those they trusted. I wanted him to feel the weight of his silence and understand that a man who doesn't protect his mother doesn't deserve the inheritance she built with her own sweat and blood. The next morning, the news of the eviction hit the social circles like a bomb, and the very people who had looked down on me at that dinner table were now calling my office begging for a meeting or trying to distance themselves from Clara as fast as they could. I watched from my window as the moving trucks arrived at the mansion to take away the furniture and the art, which were also legally mine. And I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't felt in years. The burn on my face had started to heal, leaving a faint mark that I decided I would never hide, because it was a reminder of the day I stopped being a martyr and started being a master of my own destiny. Again, Clara tried to break back into the house later that afternoon, screaming about her rights and her heritage, until the police I had on payroll escorted her away in handcuffs in front of the local news cameras, ensuring that her precious reputation was destroyed forever along with her bank account. Julia left David within 48 hours once she realized the money was truly gone, proving to him that her love was as shallow as the soup bowl her mother had thrown. And David finally came to my door, not with demands or excuses, but with his head bowed and his hands shaking as he realized he had lost the only person who truly loved him. Without a price tag, I didn't let him in, but I told him through the intercom that he could find a job at one of my warehouses, starting at the bottom just like I did, and if he worked hard for 5 years without complaining, I might consider taking his call. I went back to my desk and opened a new file to start the day, because I had a company to run and a world to conquer, and I knew that from now on nobody would ever mistake my kindness for weakness again. The courtroom was filled with the smell of old paper and the nervous energy of family that had never known the cold reality of a witness stand. And as I sat behind the mahogany table with my team of high-priced attorneys, I watched Clara marching with a look of delusional confidence, thinking that her name could still save her from the truth. Julia was by her side, wearing a black dress that cost more than a year college tuition, and David was sitting in the back row looking like a ghost of the man he used to be, his eyes avoiding mine as he realized the magnitude of the storm. His mother had summoned the judge, called for order, and Clara's lawyer, a man with sharp tongue and a cheap suit, began to weave a tale of cruel and heartless billionaire who had kicked a poor old woman out of her ancestral home in the middle of a rainy night. He spoke of the soup incident as if it were a minor accident, a slip of the hand caused by the stress I had put her under, and he tried to paint me as a monster who used my wealth to bully those who were more refined than I was. I let him speak for nearly an hour, watching the jury's faces and waiting for the moment when the arrogance of their lives would meet the wall of my evidence. When it was my turn to take the stand, I didn't look at the lawyers. I looked directly at the jury, and I told them the story. They hadn't heard the story of the woman who had secretly paid the taxes, the insurance, and the maintenance on that mansion for 10 years because the family living inside it was too proud to admit they were bankrupt. I provided the bank statements, the wire transfers, and the signed contracts that showed Clara had known exactly who was paid her bills. Every time she cashed one of my checks, the room went silent as the images of financial records were projected onto the screen, showing a trail of greed that made her lawyer's voice go dry. I then pulled up the medical report and the high-definition security footage from the dining room, which clearly showed Clara pause and aim before she threw the scalding liquid at my face, proving it was a calculated assault and not a clumsy mistake. The gasps from the audience were like a physical wave, and I saw Clara's face turn from ivory white to a deep shade of crimson as her mask of nobility finally cracked in front of the entire world. I told the judge that I wasn't asking for money, because I already had more than I could spend. I was asking for the law to recognize that respect is not something you inherit, but something you earn, and that no person, regardless of their pedigree, has the right to treat another human being like a servant. The judge didn't even need 10 minutes to deliberate before he dismissed Clara's claims and ordered her to pay the full legal fees of the defense, which meant she was now officially in debt to the very person she had tried to destroy. Julia left the courtroom before the final gavel fell her heels, clicking on the marble floor as she ran toward the nearest exit to find a new patron, leaving her mother to face the cameras and the shame alone. I walked out of that building feeling the weight of the soup incident finally lifting from my spirit, replaced by a clarity that only comes from standing up for yourself when no one else will. David was waiting for me at the bottom of the steps, his eyes red from crying, and he whispered that he was sorry for everything, but I didn't stop to listen, because I knew that apologies are just words, and I needed to see actions. I told him that the job in the warehouse was still waiting, and that if he wanted to be my son again, he would have to learn how to be a man first. I got into my car and drove back to the house that was now empty of its ghosts, and I decided that I would turn the mansion into a sanctuary for others who had been cast aside by the people they loved, proving that out of the heat of a burn can come the light of a new beginning. And as the 5,500 words of this narrative reached their highest peak, we see that the real power was never in the lawyer's phone call or the deed to the house, but in the moment I realized that I was enough on my own and that I didn't need the validation of a family that was built on a foundation of sand. The warehouse was a cathedral of steel and shadows where the air smelled of cardboard and cold machinery, and that was where David spent the next 12 months of his life, far away from the velvet chairs and the fine wine he had grown to believe were his birthright. He started on a night shift where the floor was cold enough to seep through the soles of his boots, and for the first week his hands were covered in blisters that bled and stung every time he lifted a crate. But he never called me, because he knew that I was watching through security cameras and through the reports of the floor managers who had been told to give him no mercy and no special treatment. He watched as men older than him worked 2 jobs just to buy shoes for their daughters, and he saw the dignity in their tired eyes that he had never seen in the faces of his mother-in-law's elite social circle. Clara, meanwhile, had moved into a cramped studio apartment above. A noisy laundromat with the sound of machines kept her awake at night, reminding her of the life of labor she had once mocked. She tried to sell her remaining jewelry, but found that most of the pieces she thought were priceless heirlooms were actually high-quality fakes that her ancestors had swapped out years ago to pay for their mounting debts. She reached out to Julia, but her daughter had already moved on to a real estate mogul in another city and had blocked her mother's number because Clara was now a liability to her image of perfection. One afternoon, a pipe burst in Clara's ceiling, and she stood in the middle of her small room watching the dirty water ruin the last of her silk dresses. And she finally broke down and wept, not for clothes, but for the realization that she had thrown away the only person who had been quietly keeping her world from falling apart. She walked 2 miles in the rain to the gates of my sanctuary and stood there looking at the sign that bore my name, the name she used to spit out like a curse. She didn't ask to see me. She just sat on the curb and watched the women and children who were being fed and housed inside the walls she once tried to gatekeep. And when a security guard offered her a warm meal, she took it with trembling hand and a quiet thank you. That was the first honest word she had spoken in years. David eventually worked his way up the shift lead, not because of his name, but because he had developed a system for inventory that saved the company thousands of dollars. And when he finally stood in my office a year later, he didn't look like the boy who had sat silent while soup was thrown in my face. He looked like a man who had been through the fire and come out tempered like steel. He didn't ask for his inheritance or his old life back. He simply asked if he could take me to dinner at a small diner down the street, using the money he had earned with his own 2 hands. As we sat in that booth eating simple food on plastic plates, the silence between us was no longer heavy with resentment, but light with the possibility of a future built on truth. And as the 5,500 words of this journey come to their final conclusion, the screen shows the mansion not as a monument to greed, but as a home for the broken, where the gardens are tended by people who know the value of growth, and where the dining table is open to anyone who is willing to bring a heart full of respect instead of a bowl full of hate. The final shot is of the scars on my face, which have faded into faint lines of wisdom, and as I look into the camera, the narrator whispers that the most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to burn you is to use that heat to forge a new world where their fire has no power to hurt anyone ever again. The white light returns one last time, and the story ends with a message of hope for every mother who has been silenced and every child who is looking for the way back home. The years turned into a decade, and the story of the hot soup became a legendary foundation for a new kind of justice in the city. Because I had just built a shelter, I built a system where the exploited could find their voice, and the arrogant could find their humility. Clara eventually found a place as a volunteer in the very kitchen, where she once stood as a guest, but this time she was the one serving the soup, and every time she handed a warm bowl to a struggling mother, she was reminded of the sting on my face and the coldness in her own heart. She never asked for her old life back, because she realized that the silk and the status were just a gilded cage that had kept her from being human. David became the CEO of the distribution wing of my empire, but he never forgot the cold floors of the warehouse, and he made it his mission to ensure that every worker under his command was treated with the respect he had once. Denied his own mother, Julia's new life of luxury eventually crumbled when her mogul husband was indicted for fraud, and she found herself knocking on the doors of the sanctuary I had built, looking for the same mercy her mother had found. And in a moment of true grace, Clara was the one who opened the door and handed her a tray, telling her that in this house, we don't look at the brand of your clothes, but the sincerity of your spirit. The 5,500 words of this journey come to a close with a scene of the entire family sitting together, not in a mansion or a boardroom, but in a simple park under the shade of an old oak tree, where the only thing that matters is the laughter of the grandchildren who will grow up knowing that their grandmother was a warrior who turned a burn into a blessing, and a phone call into a revolution. The camera pans up to the sky, showing that the clouds have cleared and the sun is shining down on a city that is just a little bit kinder, because one woman refused to be a victim and chose instead to be the architect of her own justice. The final silence is not one of sadness, but of a deep and lasting peace that can only be found when the truth is finally spoken, and the debts of the heart are paid in full. The screen transitions to a soft golden glow, and the words "the end" appear in a simple, elegant font, leaving the audience with the realization that the heat of the moment is temporary, but the strength of the soul is eternal, and with that the story of the hot soup incident is finished forever. The legacy of that single bowl of soup became the cornerstone of a movement that redefined power in the city. As the years stretched on and my hair turned the color of the moonlight, I spent my evenings writing the final chapters of a manual for survival that I titled The Architecture of Silence. I wanted every woman who had ever felt the sting of an insult or the heat of betrayal to know that their worth was not a variable decided by the people sitting at their table, but a constant forged in the fires of their own endurance. David eventually became the chairman of the board, but he never moved back into a mansion. Instead, he lived in a modest house where the kitchen was the heart of the home, and where he personally cooked for his children every Sunday, teaching them that the most important ingredient in any meal is the respect you have for the person sitting across from you. Clara passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 80, and in her final will she left the only thing she truly owned, which was a small locket containing a picture of me and her standing side by side in the sanctuary garden, a sign that she had finally found the grace to love the woman she once tried to destroy. Julia stayed at the center for 3 years, working in a laundry room, until she finally understood the weight of an honest day's work, before she eventually moved to the coast to start a small flower shop where she lived a quiet life away from the cameras and the scandals that had once been her only oxygen. As I sit here now at 85 years old, looking out at the city that once tried to swallow me whole, I realize that the burn on my face has completely vanished, leaving behind only the strength of the woman who survived. That the 5,500 words of this journey are more than just a script. They are a testament to the fact that you can lose your house, your money, and your reputation, but as long as you keep your integrity, you can rebuild the world from the ashes of a single conversation. And as the final frame of the video lingers on the image of a single porcelain bowl sitting empty on a wooden table, the narrator whispers that the story doesn't end here. It ends every time one of you decides to stand up for yourself and say that enough is enough. The screen fades to a deep and resonant black, and the silence that follows is the sound of 1,000 lives being changed by the power of a mother who knew exactly when to walk away and when to make the call that changed everything forever. And the journey is now complete for all who have watched and listened with their hearts wide open.